record. I have done that. So all you. If you're speaking, I can't hear you.
No, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. And you have the first slide up on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll admit this is not going to be the most aesthetic presentation, but hopefully informative. Right. That's obviously a reference to the fact that the conferences of the parties, the UNFCC, have a maybe marginally better reputation than
Cops.
the actual police.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that they are like the police, much required institution and worth preserving to some extent, although we can of course debate how much reform is needed. Right, that is just the animal theme, although I'm cheating a bit there. Right, so the first thing I think it's important to understand about the COPs is that the logistics are now insane. The participation regularly exceeds 10,000 people. As you can see from the little graphs to the right, I've put in a source so you can expand them on your own later if you'd like to. But Paris COP in 2015 went close to 20,000 people. Even the COP right after that had like close to 15,000 people. So huge numbers of people attending this. There's a lot of representation in terms of observer organizations who have a role at the COPs in that they can make interventions in the meetings. But there are different types of observers, obviously, and there's a lot of participation from what are known as research, academic institutions, environmental advocacy organizations, which are environmental NGOs. But there's also an identification of a separate segment of organizations which represent the interests of the youth. And those, as you can see from the pie chart, are far less represented. The second part of the
I can't
scale
quite
is this
see
idea of,
the numbers, so maybe you can just read it out since you, I'm sure, can see it.
is it tucked behind? Is the slide itself cut off, or is it tucked
No,
behind you?
No, it's. I mean, meaning if you blow it up, I'll be able to see it better.
Yeah. So, I see. Sorry. Okay. So, for example, ENGOs, which are environmental NGOs, are about 38% of the total participation of observers.
Yeah, bottom right. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Business NGOs, which are referred to as bingos, which makes them sound a lot more friendly than they actually are about 15 to 16% of the participation of observers, whereas youngos, which are organizations which represent the youth, are just about 5%. Organizations which represent women's interests and generally which speak for gender issues are even less than that, about 2%. Right. So the other part, there's a bunch of side events which are meant to sort of generate a knowledge base around the COPs, but there's hundreds of them. Each country pavilion has its own schedule of side events. So if you are relying on side events to get your point across, you have a bit of an obstacle. The third obstacle is that observers have the right to attend meetings and subsidiary bodies, but they don't have the right to vote. The right to vote is not the issue. The issue is that increasingly observer organizations are even being shut out of the negotiating sessions, even as observers, because chairs may close the group to observers at any time, and they may declare it an informal meeting. There was then a bunch of advocacy to get observers into informal meetings, which is now led to the creation or institutionalization of informal meetings, which are referred to in the obtuse language of COPs as inf-infs. Right. Yeah. So there's also there's a bunch of meetings throughout the year. So the COPs are usually in December of whatever year. There's a mid-year meeting, which is the meeting of the subsidiary bodies. There are two subsidiary bodies, one in scientific and technological. I forget what the A is, and one is called the subsidiary body on implementation, and they meet in June. So there's increasing participation even at these mid-year meetings because there's an increasing sense that that's where the action is. Right. So to deal with that scale, if I'm not suggesting that Green Up goes and participates as an entity in COPs, but generally the agenda for the COP gets set way before the COP, so it gets set almost at the beginning of the year and then gets sort of hardened at the June meetings. So even if one can't make it to those meetings, you have to be able to track those meetings, and there are documents available online, and we'll get to what the difficulties in interpreting those documents are. But there is generally material online to track those meetings. The second thing is that with those kinds of numbers, you cannot work without a coalition. Not even say the World Resources Institutes and that kind of old big advocacy organizations can move any of these agendas on their own. They rely heavily on networks, and if you are interested in making a difference at the COP, which is not the only area to make a difference at, but if you're interested in that area, it has to get done through coalitions. The useful thing to remember when forming coalitions, and this can be between observer organizations or between observers and countries, is that every nation, even the smallest ones, get a vote. So with the right kind of coalition, you can in fact achieve quite a lot. And the other reason why coalitions are important is because there is an absolute proliferation of negotiating rooms, many discussions going on parallelly, even on what you might consider a single issue. So your coalition gets you access to quote unquote like intelligence on what's happening in multiple rooms. The other ways to deal with the scale, which I'll expand on a little bit, are some understanding of how issues are being framed, a focus on targeting the text, which is the decision text that emerges at the end of a COP, and to follow up at home. That's just another bit on the theme. These are all, by the way, quotes said by this particular creature, which you could take a guess at the end. Sorry, I'm just going to look at chat for a second. There, I can get you a good guess, Rajesh, but I can get you a kind of graphic on nations, less on NGOs, but there is a graphic on coalitions, different kinds of coalitions between nations. So I'll probably send you guys that as well. Right. Yeah, there we go. Now, when it comes to framing of issues, the issues themselves, as like the ones that we discuss even at these regular catch-ups, are quite familiar. It's about emissions reduction, it's about adaptation and resilience, scaling of finance, equity, differentiation. So those, they are familiar. But the framing of those issues is somewhat specific at the COPs because from year to year and meeting to meeting, negotiators are quite focused on sorting out some aspects of some issues. So if you deal in the general politics of the issue, you tend to come up against a little bit of a wall. So the challenge is to link your politics, your political understanding of an issue, which is crucial, to the specifics of what's being discussed at that particular COP. So a couple of examples is you may take the political position that carbon markets often create very dubious emissions reductions and their use should be limited. But what has been discussed in the past 3 COPs is a more specific issue, which is should the credits that were created under the old clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, should they be, there's a bunch of them that have been unsold and sitting with 3 countries in particular. So should they be allowed to be sold as part of the new market mechanism? And that's a very, it's a specific and an extremely complicated issue. There is a way to link this politics to the issue, but it takes a bit of work. Another example is that one believes that all countries are not equally responsible for the climate crisis. But to my mind, the specific issue that's being discussed at the COP on which this kind of position has the most bearing is whether there's this global stock take, which is scheduled for 2023, whether that stock taking exercise needs to evaluate the sufficiency of each country's targets and action, or just the sufficiency of the globe's action as a whole. So you can make the argument, if you are interested in saying that all countries are not equally responsible, you would say that that stock taking has to look at it country by country, not just as a whole. But you need to connect the two. Some of the current issues, it's not an exhaustive list, but these are among the higher profile issues, and we could possibly talk about and think about how our priorities fit into these buckets and some others. Right. And that's old generation meets. In terms of the text, which is, I suggested that you need to target the text, and we're talking about the decision text. Each COP comes up with a decision, and this is a part of COPs that people just do not like, because they are very much about full stops and commas, and especially brackets, which are when countries disagree about a particular bit of text, they put brackets around it. So the decision text is chock full of brackets till very late. But these are, to my mind, if you want to engage with the COPs, this is the most important outcome of a COP, because it's effectively the agenda that sets a lot of other agendas, both nationally and in terms of future. So well before you get a treaty or a legal instrument, you have a bunch of decisions that lead up to that treaty or instrument. So this is the agenda that sets the other agendas. And the aim of any COP-focused advocacy effort has to be to get your preferred text into the final decision. And this is an irritating exercise, and it's not to everybody's liking, but if you're interested in making change at the COPs, which again is not the only way to make change, but change at the COPs happens through this mechanism. And there's some very exciting decision text image on the right there. Right. Now, obviously, right until the point that everything is the whatever the usual quote is, until everything is agreed, nothing is agreed. So right up to the point of agreement, the text is often filled with brackets, which is makes for very difficult reading. But the brackets are effectively there to indicate options. And when looking at options, the temptation is to think this all just looks like, for example, Groot saying, "I'm Groot," because it looks all indistinguishable from each other. But there are differences. There's a good reason why people are flying diplomats to some locations for them to shove bits of text into a draft decision. And an example of that is when you look at the finance commitment in the Paris Agreement, which is the example that I've pasted here. As part of a global effort, developed country parties should continue to take the lead in mobilizing climate finance from a wide variety of sources, instruments, and channels. Now, that emerged, that was the final text that emerged from the bunch of options that I've put in the image here. And the critical part of this is that the final text does not ever say the word private anywhere. It doesn't say private finance. But the word mobilized has now been interpreted to mean that countries can claim private finance that have been raised through their efforts as part of their financial commitments. And this is a huge controversy in finance, whatever, climate finance discussions going forward. And you would not get that from the word mobilizing unless you've taken, and these are not the only options, by the way, it goes on, there's an option 4, 5, etc., plus 5A, 5B. And you would not get that unless you look at the options and look at the fact that, okay, there were some countries who wanted to explicitly include private finance. There were some countries who were adamant that public finance needs to be prioritized. So what they've settled on is this mobilizing from a wide variety of sources, instruments, and channels. The takeaway from that, I think, is that when you're trying to advocate at this kind of forum, proposals which allow some amount of constructive ambiguity, and this is another fun little phrase from international law and international treaties, whatever, academia, some amount of constructive ambiguity are useful because it allows a bunch of countries to walk away saying, we've got what we want. And you then have to do the next part of this presentation, which is, this is I think my favorite quote because it just kind of summarize what COPs are about. You have to follow up at home. So, this, even the Paris Agreement, for that matter, even the Kyoto Protocol, they're all, they're all legal. They have legal character. They are binding in terms of international law, which is a very academic kind of distinction to make, but they don't have any enforcement mechanism. So what you really need to do is take these decisions and even the agreement and to some extent implement them in domestic law, which is where you can implement implement your understanding of what the agreement says. So that's the way to potentially walk away from a negotiation with somewhat of constructive ambiguity. But then you resolve the constructive ambiguity in your domestic by giving it a very specific character in your domestic legal system. So, for example, currently countries are required to submit these nationally determined contributions, national targets, but there's no enforcement mechanism. But in theory, at the international level, in theory, you could make them legally binding in domestic law. You could have an Indian climate law that says if the government fails to achieve, or if the government fails to enact policies that are in consonance with these targets, then the policy is liable to be struck down by an Indian court of law. Now, some of this kind of climate litigation has been successful. The example that I've linked to is a case from Netherlands where a foundation got the state of Netherlands to accept a domestic target, a domestic whatever limit on emissions. But I would suggest that better than one-off litigation is having a legal framework. It's also important to use the space created by international negotiations to push domestic action. This is where that agenda that sets other agendas idea becomes quite important. So if the Paris Agreement says that the global stocktake is supposed to happen in 2023, when should India be scheduling its national stocktake, and should people be pushing for that at the national level, because that is what will prepare us to. It's not just a matter of holding ourselves accountable. If we do this exercise now, we can then go to the international level and hold other countries accountable. So it's crucial, I think, to have this kind of follow up, and that is, I think, the best way to understand or move past the limitations of the COP process to something that can take those agendas and those decisions and actually turn them into something that make a tangible difference in people's lives. There is also some reading on, as you correctly guessed, Rajesh, ents, which are walking, talking trees from The Lord of the Rings. That wraps my presentation.
Thank you so much, Tarun. Fascinating presentation. I have lots of questions, but maybe I'll let someone else go first if they want to go. We always have the raised hand as a method, but we can also type into the chat window or just start speaking. All right, since no one else seems to be jumping in, I will ask one question to start with, right? Which is the COP, as you ended with. I mean, it's a legal agreement, right? And it's supposed to be binding, but because it doesn't have enforcement, it can be neglected if needed. So, what is there an international process going on that says we need to make this agreement have some enforcement? So basically countries collectively agreeing that we will actually implement it. And so there must be a schedule to turn this into national policy or law.
So the answer to the first question, there have been a lot of proposals to make these legally binding and have an enforcement mechanism at the international level itself. For example, there was a proposal, I believe, by Brazil at the time of the Kyoto Protocol that said that if developed countries fail to meet their Kyoto commitments, they pay a fine equivalent to the shortfall, and that goes into a fund that will then be dispersed to developing countries to take up whatever climate friendly activities within their borders. So there's also been European proposals to kind of have a quasi court system which judges when countries are falling short of their commitments. There are often carbon border taxes proposed, which operate based on whether you're keeping your commitments or not. All like there will be no enforcement mechanism at the international level. There just won't be. If you have an enforcement mechanism, it will happen at the domestic level, and it will happen in each domestic jurisdiction. Now, to some extent, there is a spillover effect. If you create a legal obligation in one jurisdiction, other jurisdictions tend to take notice. Just like Indian courts sometimes cite American decisions,
Yeah.
British courts sometimes cite Indian decisions, so on and so forth. So that is the mechanism by which to make it enforceable throughout the world. But in terms of it's particularly the US. The US just stops any discussion of enforcement mechanisms at the international level. Does not like it.
And I think that's blanketly true, right? I mean, it's not just about COP. The US does not like.
It doesn't like the NPT, which is,
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't accept enforcement of nuclear non-proliferation. So climate change is quite a long way away.
Okay. I have another question, but I'm going to see if again. So Naina, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to continue Rajesh's question, right? So Tarun, you just said super presentation, by the way, very insightful. So you spoke about like domestic jurisdiction, no? Is there any country that's doing it right in terms of like legal frameworks? Because like say, suppose India had to sort of work on that. Like for the privacy law, we always had the EU GDPR as like the gold standard, right? Is there other, like in this, the climate law space, is there any other country that we should be reading about?
The UK has the strongest national climate law in place at the moment.
Okay.
So they have a hard decarb by 2040 or 2045 written international law. The European Union is also coming out with the quote unquote the European Green Deal will eventually be a European Commission document, which is effectively legislation covering Europe. So these are the examples to draw from, I think. Obviously, while being mindful that our commitments are different from those of development.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I'm going to randomly start telling people to ask questions. Kavya, go for it.
I can go next. Thanks, Tarun. This is really interesting. Can I find out if you have any more information about how the coalitions are used for lobbying purposes? I mean, is it all like happening clandestinely, or is it like an open secret that basically coalitions are being used to put forward like certain corporate agendas? I mean, I know only of the COP, the alternative COP. That's what I get to hear from the activists, the place that was put outside, because yeah, most people don't even want to participate in the COP, but I feel like that's a very niche or like fringe take on COP still. And so I was curious what you found out.
Yeah, there is a lot. I mean, the biggest kind of complaint in terms of covert negotiation is the fact that certain groups of countries regularly meet with fossil fuel representatives. One of the most consistent long-term participants at COPs are like representatives from BP, from Exxon. Whoever else attends or doesn't attend, they attend. They make sure. So, and they have a lot of little side meetings with country representatives that are obviously never reported on, and you can only see the effects of them later. So there's in fact a movement to just completely ban fossil fuel representatives from COPs, which is unlikely to happen. That's the most specific instance. There's a lot of, I mean, it's diplomacy, so there's a lot of covert negotiation happening. I think it is important to distinguish useful covert negotiation from maybe less useful stuff. Sometimes you just have to accept that people are willing to compromise better in private. But this kind of specialized access to certain groups, that's the sort of thing that needs to be targeted quite strongly.
Great. Preeta, you had a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can.
No, I was just saying that, is there something that we could, I mean, how do we take this to say for instance, I mean, is there something that we could take or learn from maybe, I don't know if it's the origin of COP or something to think about our work in the Northeast or the overall thing of work?
You're saying in terms of like what, creating a COP-like thing for at a national level, or?
No, I'm just, I mean, I'm quite open. I mean, I don't have a fixed thing, but I'm just trying to understand, like, is there some learning that we could take?
Let me see if I can interpret your question, Prachur, based on, I know the conversations we have both been part of. And it may actually not be a question, but nevertheless ask it, right? Which is that some of our conversations with people in the Northeast, they have expressed this issue that they are invited to COP negotiations as indigenous communities or as members of certain regional interests in India and so on. But when they go there, they don't, I mean, they feel they're there as window dressing, right? That somebody is ticking a checkbox. But how can they inform themselves of the COP and be effective contributors or negotiate for their interests? So maybe that's the one way of me lensing Prachur's question is there a kind of how to advocate your interests at COP that is a useful skill to have? And if so, how might one go about getting it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have. I think CDKN. There's a couple of organizations, the Center for International Environmental Law, who do like training for non-governmental, for lesser represented observers, who kind of do like, this is what the COP is about. This is what they're discussing at the moment, which is sort of an expansion, a little bit of the themes that I've just like very briefly touched on here. So it could, you could, one way to make these people more effective, it's absolutely right that there's a sense of tokenism, but that sense of tokenism is because I think people fail to people just fail to understand the scale of the thing. It's flat out insane stepping in there and trying to make sense of what's happening if you don't have a briefing beforehand, like a big one. So yeah, that is a way for just putting together that kind of training for people who are going to the COP for the first or second time would be useful. Yeah, in terms of lessons from the COP more generally, I think at the national level you should not imitate the COP. Like, the COP is very much a creation of the fact of international negotiations and the fact that sovereignty and all plays a big role. At the national level, you have the ability, I think, when you're convening a meeting, to give what are now known as observer groups in the COPs. You can give them voting rights. You can give them like much stronger rights at national convenings than you can at the international level, and you should do that. Like, I remember I was talking about those policy councils in Brazil. That would be more the kind of model for national convenings, including the North. It would be particularly important to give indigenous people more than just a seat at the table, but like institutionalized rights at these national convenings.
Very interesting. So that is a kind of a souped up COP that can be institutionalized. I mean, that would be very, and I can certainly see in a country like India that would play an important role, or could.
Yeah. To some extent, I think there is already some rights in land acquisition and stuff like that, and over forest governance. But yeah, if you're creating a broader climate conference kind of thing, rights rather than just participation.
Yeah, Great. Tarini, did you have a point or were you just answering Kavya's question?
I did have some observations. I was answering her question and also going to add that, I mean, I wished I was on the protesters' side. I got the text late. It was really dramatic, that we're going to protest now and like block this meeting from happening. So I got to go inside the meeting and it was ridiculous. I mean, how I saw it, it made no sense to me. I've never understood. I mean, I don't know anything about any of what you shared, Tarun. So thank you so much for the presentation. That was really informative. The meeting was basically like the Swiss bank and the president, I don't know, someone from Switzerland, the political leaders sitting on the same podium and having a conversation about like their Facebook chat, like what they see on Facebook of like glaciers melting. That was the kind of conversation they were having, like a very personal, oh, it's so sad that the glaciers are melting. And now let's look at like this astronaut talk to us about like how he sees the Earth from space. Like it was such a drama that so I was just this whole, the observer groups were really active, I have to say. Like they were not allowed to meetings and they had consistent meetings every morning during the COP to try and decide what to do. Like they had planned what their actions would be. Some groups would do skits to disrupt the meeting flow, and they would, pretend to be the US. They wore dinosaur outfits. They were really like active, and protest was very visible. So that was interesting, but yeah, I did not understand. I understood that the island nations have very strong teams. At least the Philippines had a very strong negotiating team, and they seem to be more organized than India or any of the South Asian countries. India and Bangladesh had some observer folks, but there was very little representation from what I understood. It seemed like there could be a lot more people there from this global South, from South Asia as well.
Great. Thanks, Dharani. We are past time, so unless somebody wants to jump in, I'm going to thank Tarun for his wonderful presentation. I do actually have a last question, which is that this creative ambiguity, is there a glossary of things that people use for creative ambiguity?
Oh, no, not that. It's literally playing around with language. I mean,
No, like this mobilize. How would I ever know that mobilize is where the action is, right?
I'll look at it. I'll look at whether there's like some organized information on this.
Yeah.
But this is the sort of thing that like negotiators just sort of rely on their training to pull out of there wherever when the need arises.
Okay.
Like they just have an instinct for what might carry the room.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Tarun. A lovely presentation. We learned a lot, and we'll hopefully lean on you to talk us through some of the other such international negotiations as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye then. So we are back on screen saying bye to each other. Time to say goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.